For me, it was a logical evolution from being a very young manager at the age of 20 and being promoted at a time when they couldn't ask your age. Otherwise, they wouldn't have promoted me at 20. But being an 8, I was self-possessed and just took charge and did what I was supposed to execute, but didn't always do it in a diplomatic way, at least not diplomatic enough. And so I was promoted, but told I needed to take management type training classes, things that would help me become more professional, and so that people would want to follow me, that I was a natural leader, but that people had to want to follow me. And I remember thinking at the time, whoa, is this a compliment or is this a criticism? And they said both. And from that point on, I took everything that was available in the 70s, 80s, and then went on to be in my own business and ended up specializing because of that information in the internal and external sense of self. And that was as an image consultant. So whether I was working with teaching you how to be self-possessed or what have you, I used it, came across the Enneagram, and it was, whoa, this clearly defines what I saw in people. I had about 7 or 8 different types of people. And then there were some variables that I also saw, but they didn't seem as complete, which I now know are the instincts. But I didn't know the full why they were doing it. It was like, well, haven't you learned that yet? Is kind of what I'm thinking. Oh, you're still afraid? Why are you still afraid? We've gone over that. But what I learned is, oh, people are meant to have these constructs based on a defense strategy. So I was all in. And that was 35 years ago. And from that point forward, I voraciously wanted to learn everything I could. But unfortunately, there were no books published. It was people teaching, and there were some good teachers like Tom Condon being one of them, and others in Berkeley. But what was available were the notes that disseminated down from Father Robert Oakes that attended Claudio Naranjo's first training and disseminated the Enneagram through the Catholic pipeline. And there was Kathy Spieth, who had been Naranjo's girlfriend at the time, and also an avid seeker herself, and had grown up in the Gurdjieff work. And her notes were amazing. And then later, I discovered that a friend of mine had attended her year-long training, and I got a whole notebook of notes and really saw important factors about the Enneagram that later were not taught. They were lost in the dissemination of the Enneagram. So after the 1994 Enneagram conference that David Daniels organized at Stanford University, I had a chance to see teachers I wasn't aware of the details of their teaching. And it was pretty extraordinary. And I saw just a huge distinction between those that had come down through Father Robert Oakes and those that somehow had learned from Kathy Spieth, or those who had learned from those who had learned from Kathy Spieth. So Naranjo and Kathy Spieth to Kathy Spieth on. And the huge distinction was the instincts in terms of the stackings and the types and the tritypes and the instinctual stackings. So that was 9 years after knowing the Enneagram. And I was really pursuing that question with everyone I met at the conference. And someone from Berkeley said, oh, those are east of the Great Divide and west of the Great Divide, meaning those who had learned the subtypes and those who had not. And the definitions of type were very different. Like, how do you explain a 4 and a sexual 4, or an emotional person, or a person that's focused on their twinship and are willing to, in a way, surrender their type in service of their, tight, close, significant other without the instincts. I was on the group that planned the 1996 conference, the first IEA conference, that was intended to bring the authors together and come up with a more consistent definition of the types. What did come out of it was that it became very clear that you had to know the instincts because Naranjo had begun adding those. Now, as far as people understood, he'd completely understood the whole concept and added it, which wasn't quite true according to Naranjo. He said he'd come up with common archetypes that he had begun to notice, but that he didn't really know all of them at the same level and therefore made changes over the years and wasn't really focused on them. He just liked the ways he could quickly see a doubter, which is a 6, or the, and the social 6, it's the more Prussian 6, what have you. But that's how I became interested. And then I decided, I got to surrender to learning these different views, and began 3 certifications simultaneously with Helen Palmer and David Daniels, with Don Riso and Rusty Hudson, and with, I knew them as Ted Dobson and Kathy Hurley. Dobson went on to become Donson, if you're ever confused. When you see it written in literature, there aren't typos. He changed his name in about 2004, actually. But as I was doing that, I also wanted to see for myself what was going on with the instincts, because I had learned with the instincts, but they were considered just a minor factor, that the type was in charge, but you could use the energy of one of 3 instinctual types to transform fixated passions and beliefs into their holy virtues and ideas. But what I saw is that actually people wouldn't even necessarily show their true type until their instinct was triggered. And they didn't just show one instinct, they showed 2 really close, or even 3, which I later called the stair-step pattern. So if we were to say I had a hypothesis, it would be that the instincts were far more significant than we understood. Now, at the time, there was nothing on that other than what Kathy had transmitted and other people had kind of interpreted, like Eli Jackson Bear or Helen Palmer, or other people that got the information by being in Berkeley and a part of a community that was very interested in self-awareness. But I put that aside and I just decided to take all the people who were at the level of certifying or were at advanced courses that I attended in that period from 1994 when I was at the conference to the early part of 1995 and sent out a questionnaire based on how people see themselves and what they'd say about the questions. And would I be able to see the instincts in the questions? Would it reveal anything more that I didn't know or anything more about the types? So I created the questionnaire. Now, what people don't know is that questionnaire is not just a simple questionnaire. It was created based on an intensive I took on how to interview people and get the most out of them in the shortest amount of time. And I did that because I'm fundamentally lazy and I didn't want to have to constantly hire people, place them, train them. Okay, they didn't work out, and hire someone else. So I had a vested interest in wanting to quickly ascertain if someone had the qualities that would fit a particular position. And because I had Denver west, including Hawaii and Alaska, that was a lot of travel that, I didn't want to do more than I had to. It's one thing traveling for fun. It's another thing traveling over and over again, doing something that's not as interesting. But I made it interesting by taking a course. And so the first 7 questions, the 5 adjectives, I guess 9 questions, greatest strength and greatest weakness and why, were a part of that. People cannot, unless they know what you're doing and they try to pre-plan their answers, if they have to come from themselves rather than a multiple choice or an either or, they're going to come from their true defense strategy and focus of attention. Now, I have since had people that put in things as their own that actually I said about myself personally. So I know that it didn't come from their inner self unless they've taken on an aspect of what I taught. And it's very easy for us to do. At first it was like, well, wait, that's what I said in that particular way. It isn't, a standard way of looking at things. So I began that, and over 400 people responded. Now, I did send a self-addressed, stamped envelope, everything. So they'd respond. We didn't have the email at that level. Not yet. People weren't on email. It was just beginning. And it was extraordinary. At first, I sorted them by type, and then I sorted them by instinct, and I sorted them by wings and moved them around to see patterns. I naturally was fortunate enough to be born with an unusual level of pattern recognition. So I can quickly see a pattern. I actually can hear it, but if I see it and hear it, I remember it. And I could quickly go, oh, wait a minute. That person is answering exactly like the 9s. That person's saying they're a 3. And how is that so? How could someone use words like, I need to be comfortable, I'm laid back, I'm busy, which was the misunderstanding. And later, the person, of course, did have the tritype that included the 3 and the 7. So it's totally understandable. But there were too many words that the 9s were using. And when I compared her questionnaire to the 3s, no, the 3s didn't say anything like that. They were talking about their dynamic nature. They were talking about their professionalism and some word talking about their execution, their excellence, their determination. Very different than laid back and an image of haphazard elegance. But haphazard elegance? So I started interviewing the 3s. Okay, what's your image? Tell me more about your image. And not one of them used that. I interviewed the people that didn't match their type. And sure enough, with further understanding, they realized they were another type. But they sincerely misunderstood. They thought if they were busy, they were a 3. If they were smart and shy and awkward, they were a 5. Many of the things that people have since learned. So that's how I got started. But the information then just spurred me on to continue. And the last research I did was in 2014, but I asked, I think, 81 questions. So I'm still getting through all that. I once took an area, a zip code in Chicago of people that were on Match.com to see who goes on Match. It was very noteworthy that the socials were the most common, and the 6 with the 7 wing, or the 7 with the 6 wing, based on, by the way, what I'd learned after tens of thousands at that point of questionnaires. You get to 1,800, it doesn't vary that much. If people truly answer like themselves, they don't ask someone, and they're not trying to trick the test, which became true. So then I took another area code and get all the match.coms. And sure enough, and then I got Florida. I thought that's about as different from Chicago as you can get. Same thing. Now, all types were represented, but the way they filled out their profile, the sixes always had the word family and what they do for their family. Social six, in particular, the Prussian six, according to Naranjo. But I guess what I didn't say is that when I took all those early results and the people I'd met over 9 years and had worked with, all my clients, all my friends, all my family, even my high school friends were exposed to the Enneagram. We were all talking about it. I began to see patterns of three. And I didn't fully understand it. I'd heard it. I looked it up. And I thought, well, everything really with the Enneagram is built on three. So I was trying to figure out subtleties. And I began to see with the interviews that people were choosing a type from each center. Now, if it was a type that was a wing, I thought, oh, it's a wing type. But when it was a wing type in a different center, like 8 with a 7 wing, and I'm talking about the core fears actually in terms of choosing. And I had been collecting data on the types, and I had some very rudimentary tests. But the interview process, I had learned to go to the core fear of someone in terms of hiring them. So I was using that. And I had kind of grouped the core fears that people could have prior to ever learning about the Enneagram. And I had studied microexpressions and faciology and body language extensively before I came to the Enneagram, and many other typologies, including Myers-Briggs. So I was seeing patterns within patterns, and I just started saying, how could they have the core fears of the 3 or 4 if they were an 8 with a 7 wing? And then what would happen, why aren't they having the core fears of the 2? If it's a line of connection, or the 9 on the other side, but that would be double gut, right? But they didn't. They had the core fears from 3 different centers, many of which I could not explain. So I began to hypothesize that we use all 3 centers, and there are 3 centers. And if you go back to Gurdjieff, there's this 3-story man, I believed that we use all 3, but the order becomes significant. And then I hypothesized that the instincts, that we use all 3, not just one, and it's not secondary. And that research was pretty extensive, both in what people sent back to me, the qualitative research, but I also did a research study in 1998 that was with 2 other people, Kit Snyder and Victoria Ruderman, on the instincts and intimacy, and found indeed the same pattern. But prior to that, I hypothesized it and continued going. So I saw this pattern of 3 centers, 1 type within each center, 3 possibilities, and then Naranjo's 3 instinctual subtypes, which were a continuation. At that time, though, I did not know that the instinctual subtypes came from Naranjo. In 1995, I'm talking about. I assumed they came down through Ichazo and taught it that way. No one corrected me either, so I guess no one else knew it at that time. But I guess what I'm saying is that the stacking became very significant to me because I had already stacked the groups of fears based on my earlier work. I hadn't really thought about that, but there was no one to talk to about it. The other people that knew enough about the Enneagram and diverse perspectives that saw the patterns just go, whatever you think, Katherine. And then when I was certifying, I asked people I sent this questionnaire and asked people to send me words, pictures, and phrases of how they related to their type, in addition to filling out the questionnaire. And boy, those pictures came in, and I was like, whoa, yeah, this is even more validating than I ever understood. I had people of the area that knew their Enneagram type, and there were many, come in and look at it. Now, for those of you who want to know, I didn't do the little cutting around the pictures on the collage. I just laid them out. That is not my nature. Small motor, not.